Thanks for coming. I appreciate you guys coming out in the busy Christmas season and in the evening when we've got lots of stuff to do. And here you are at a bookstore. It's good. So I've done a few readings for this book. This book came out in basically April 1st. And I've done a few readings, and I keep reading the first chapter because it's essentially a suspense novel, and to read anything beyond the first chapter I felt like was a spoiler, giving something away. But I've been doing it for a while now, and I want to read something new. So you lucky 10 people will get to experience me reading something that back in April I would have thought, no, I would never read this because it gets too much into kind of the plot or the character development. But so now this is a real treat for me because I've never done this and read from this part of the book. So Contract City is a near future, if you want to call it dystopian, that's fine. Near future suspense novel about a 17-year-old filmmaker who lives in 2021 Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the president has been killed, and I won't name the president, but his last name starts with an O. And that has happened in his second term, and the country kind of freaks out, goes into martial law. And so this is 7 years after this. So this is a United States that it's very much speculative, but in my mind it's something that, what if that happened, what would our country look like? And it probably wouldn't be as crazy and fanciful as a lot of Hollywood movies or books may depict. It would be very recognizable, but also very terrifying and scary. So that's what this book is about. Instead of happening in New York or San Francisco, it happens in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which it's where I grew up, and it's what I know. But to me, if the events that occurred actually were to occur, I think this would maybe happen in my hometown. So I'm going to start about 50 pages in. And so the main character is Sarah Christie. She's a filmmaker, and she wants to get the hell out of Tulsa. And so her idea is, I'm going to be a filmmaker, I'm going to get into UCLA, and I'm going to go into documentary film. And I have a subject. The political things going on and the structural things going on in Tulsa. There's a police state, and they're the first city in the country to go completely private. And while this isn't a political book, that's in the background, and it isn't going so well. And so there's a lot of pushback and backlash and a lot of suppression, but there's some things going on that she is depicting, and one of those things is graffiti tags all over town. It's the only way that any messaging can get out. And so she is making a documentary film about these graffiti tags, WH2RR, and it's one of the mysteries of the book is, what does that mean? And so here we are. She's, because she's a filmmaker, she's at an underground micro cinema. She's drugged her friend there to try to delve more into what's going on in her hometown and to try to explore things, but generally just to get away from her home life. She's 17. She's a teenager. She wants to get out of her house. So, starting just mid-scene here, her name's Sarah. She's the main character. Tim looked at her with big eyes for a calculated moment, shook his head, and then gave a face like, "Okay, are you satisfied?" There was fear in his eyes. He looked over his shoulder nervously. She pretended not to follow his gaze. Tim turned and walked away, and that's when Sarah's vision went myopic. Love at first sight is a cornball expression, or at least so Sarah had always thought. And though it wasn't really love she felt when first seeing him, the guy boy with dark skin and what looked to be dreadlocks, standing alone in the back against the wall, looking straight at Sarah, forced her to admit to herself that maybe such a thing was possible. As Tim peeled away, the guy's head was locked in her direction. Though the house lights were up, they were dim. His face was obscured, but the eyes shined. Sparks, fireflies, flame. She wasn't sure which, but they weren't glowing. The light they contained appeared at swift angles, very movement defined. Those eyes stirred something in her. She flashed on a memory of herself as a girl visiting the zoo. Mom and Dad had accidentally left her alone at the tiger cage. The tiger opened up in a big, toothy yawn, and within a blink was coming straight for her, his eyes locked on hers. And though her mind knew there was a fence, her reptilian brain caused her to scream and back up. Her dad returned, and standing behind her, placed his hand warm and firm on her shoulder. "It's okay, honey, that tiger can't get you." Now that same urge to cry out and take a step back rose in her chest. The guy just looked at her, his body language projecting not allure, but poised stalk. She needed to force herself to break out of the stare, so she looked at Nikki, who was watching and smiling. Nikki put a V of fingers to her mouth and jutted her thumb toward the exit. Sarah considered. No, going out there for a cigarette would be stalling, taking the weak way out. She wouldn't do it. And what was the situation anyway? So he was looking at her. Intensely, yes, and he still was, but so what? Little girls scream and back away. They go and have a cigarette. Maybe. Or a cigarette and gripe. She shook her head at Nikki, who shrugged and walked toward the door. On the way out, she found Tim, and Tim nodded, looking straight at Nikki's chest. Sure, he'd like a cigarette. Out they went. Sarah turned back toward the screen, paused, knowing she was being watched, spun as elegantly as she could without looking too self-conscious, and made for the small bar. She got a beer, no ID required, though she had a good one in her pocket, at least good enough for dim rooms and small bars. She took a sip, and in the clusters of people saw no one she knew, and thus no one with whom to talk. She was now regretting not going with Nikki and panicked a little. But when she turned for the door to see if she could catch up with them, he appeared right in front of her, blocking her forward motion. She almost fell, and he put his hand on her shoulder. She accidentally spilled beer on his shoe. "It's okay," he said. "No harm." She looked up, and he smiled at her. It was a warm, disarming smile, one that didn't seem to belong to the intense person she'd seen against the wall. His demeanor was so completely different that she looked back over at the space to see if he was still there. "Nice shirt," he added. Sarah looked down at her chest, having forgotten what it said. "Oh, yeah, thanks. Are you property of the Tulsa Police Department?" "No." She caught herself laughing girlishly, a cocktail hour laugh she'd heard her mother emit. She straightened her face and cleared her throat. "No, I'm not. It's just a shirt." "What are you saying wearing a shirt like that?" "Nothing. It's just a shirt." "Isn't it demeaning? Don't you feel demeaned? Or do you like that sort of thing?" "I don't know what you mean." She did and she didn't. She knew what he meant on an intellectual level, but she wasn't sure she understood what he meant by saying it to her. She questioned her understanding of the situation. "Sure you do. It's clearly sexual innuendo, and you know it. Property of a group of men of absolute authority stretched across your chest. But that doesn't interest me because it's obvious. What interests me is where you got it." Her first reaction was not to tell him it was her dad's, that he had given it to her. His tone rankled Sarah, and inside she said, "Fuck this guy." "Oh, it's my dad's. He gave it to me while I sat on his lap, under the sub rosa promise of sexual favors. Our little secret. I'm not supposed to tell." "But you did, didn't you?" "Yes, I'm naughty." He paused and then smiled big. He could lighten up and then tighten down so quickly that she couldn't read him at all. His pause was weird and his smile too big, and it didn't seem fake. She thought that maybe he was guilty of overthinking. I'm sorry. She thought that maybe she was guilty of overthinking him, the film, her mother holding hands with the pastor. "Your dad's a cop. Was a cop before." "Yeah, he's in security now," Sarah said with derision. He lifted his chin in acknowledgement. "Free Force Tulsa! Hallelujah! Praise God!" They simultaneously raised their hands with revival flair and laughed. She looked into his eyes, got caught in their greenness, and was hooked. To combat the swoon coming over her, she said, without compunction, "Your eyes look green. Your skin is brown. Your hair's in dreads. What the hell are you? And don't tell me I've offended you. Your t-shirt says Whitey." She knew she hadn't offended him, but still, what she said was bold. She crawled into an elastic tick of time and waited. For a moment, the glower came back into his eyes, and her brain made her hear a rumbling tiger growl in his throat. She tried to hide the big gulp of a swallow, shellacking it with a coy smile. But then his face relaxed and he said, "My mom's white. What's your name, girl?" "Sarah." "Sarah what?" "Sarah Page Christie." And she just said it. She hadn't even thought about it. It just came out. She'd included her middle name so that it had an artist's ring. A writer of literature, a thespian, a documentary filmmaker. He laughed at her and shook his head in apparent disbelief. His eyes were like stoked coals in the house lights turning down for the next screening. That flash, it scared Sarah, something in it so quick and so quickly covered up. He stifled his laughter, but she thought it was more than that. It was glee at first. He stifled bubbling glee. She didn't understand. About her name? Was it that funny? Why did his face then contain a sinister expression, appearing and then retreating so quickly? It left her breathless, just being in his proximity to its rush and rage and exodus, its distempered wave. Say that again? There were no signs of muted hilarity this time. It was just a request, as if he hadn't heard it fully. "What, my name?" "Sarah Christie." "No." His eyes laughed. "What was the middle one?" "I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you." He nodded to the projector, indicating the sound of the next film being queued up. The house lights went down. "Are you fucking with me?" He was making fun of her for having a pretentious three-pronged name, and she burned. Tilting her head, she put on a smile that she hoped said, "I don't mind if you're fucking with me, go ahead." She sipped her beer. "Page. Sarah Page Christie." "Really? Wow, that's..." He turned away to look at the screen, and he wasn't seeing it. His thumb and index finger squeezed his bottom lip. He turned back to her. "That's a really neat name. I dig the three-name thing. You're a budding artist, right? That's an artist's name. Actress? He had messed with her. And now he was being complimentary, as if he was making up for being rude initially. She would come to understand his strangeness, she thought. It attracted her like nothing she'd ever felt. She felt heated at her throat and behind her ears. His darkness, his feral unpredictability, his soft eyes with girl's lashes that could grow hard and frightening in a second. And he was a little older, that was certainly it too. He was definitely not high school. Sarah shook her head and gulped down some beer, trying like hell to keep cool. She looked at the screen and answered, "Film." She fought to keep her eyes on the screen. In her peripheral vision, she saw he was looking at her, just standing still, taking her in. She could not understand how her parents had fallen out of love. If this is what it feels like at its inception, at its conception, like this glorious birth happening, euphoric, how do you lose that? If love is this kind of drug, and this is what it feels like, a goddamn barbiturate invading her medulla oblongata, her involuntary brain functions commandeered, why would you ever want to come down? How could you? She turned and did something she'd never done. She took his hand, this strange boy, and looked up at him. He rubbed his thumb across the top of her wrist in a single sweep, his skin cool and dry. Satisfied, she let the hand drop. They turned, stood shoulder to shoulder, and watched the short film. Sarah barely paid attention. It was a pastiche of images and freaky music, a stab at art, which would have been pretentious if it weren't trying so hard. It wouldn't have mattered if a never-before-viewed Fellini was screening right now. She wouldn't have had the discipline to focus. She imagined herself floating in front of them both, considering the scene and saying to herself, look at this, this guy you've met. See what happens when you don't assume, Sarah? When you just let the film of your life roll? Life offers such bounty if you'll just open up to it. Nikki tapped her on the shoulder. Hey, bitch, she whispered. Does this one suck too? Yeah. What's up? Nikki's breath reeked of ash and beer and gum. Who's this guy? She said, playfully bumping Sarah's hip with hers. Sarah collected herself and smiled. She pivoted to Nikki and gave her the clandestine face only girls can give each other when they think they've met someone special. In response, Nikki returned the face only girls can give each other that says, really? I'm so excited for you. Sidling up to Nikki and motioning toward the screen, Tim gave Sarah a curled lip and a thumbs down hidden up near his collar. Sarah nodded. He leaned in. What are you guys doing later? He said. Nothing, said Nikki, shrugging in a way that meant something with you. Sarah shook her head and shrugged. Nikki gave her big eyes. What about him? Nikki glanced over Sarah's shoulder, showing concern. Sarah turned. He was gone. She realized he hadn't even asked his name. What are you doing here? Anything. You're here, come on.
Why a 17-year-old female protagonist?
It's just what occurred to me. And I think most any creative person, no matter their art form, would just say, I don't know, it just came to me. To kind of, give that a little bit more ballast, I would say that I wanted to write I wrote this book mostly in 09, 010, and I was kind of feeling things were getting weird in the country, and if you hear certain candidates talk now, things are getting pretty weird, just as weird as it was back then. And I thought, whoa, what if the country goes this direction? What might happen? And then President Obama ended up in the mix, and I thought, okay, well, that changes what I was thinking, but what if what I think could maybe happen to him? If that happened to him, what would happen? And so it's all fiction, all art maybe I would say, but all stories are an extrapolation of what if this happened. And so I thought, what if in middle America, if this had happened, we have a president who was assassinated and we had martial law, and then here we are 6-7 years after martial law, and we focus in on this mid-America family. What do they look like? What are they going through? What's happening? And so I just zeroed in on them. And that's why her. Something about a teenager, a documentary filmmaker just struck me. And it all kind of surrounded her and her dad. It's very much a daddy-daughter story. And it was going to vacillate between both of them, but I was writing the dad's parts and I didn't like it. It felt really stale and it had been done before. It almost felt gumshoe-ish. And so I stuck with her. And I wasn't thinking YA, dystopian, any of this stuff. I had not read The Hunger Games, but it was just going to be about her. And so that's why it just popped into my head. She was going to be this new generation telling the story of what was going on in her world and maybe what could possibly go on here if things got out of control. That's why. Anybody, anything? Yeah?
Why Tulsa? Just because you're from Tulsa?
I grew up there, yeah.
No idea.
Why Tulsa?
Yeah.
That's a good one. Because for one thing, so many books are written in the big cities, in New York or in San Francisco or whatever, and I just wanted to avoid that, and I thought for this kind of story, what makes it more impactful and I thought scary was that it happened in middle America, in a city that maybe you don't hear of much. It's kind of flyover country, and if things are happening there, then maybe it's happening everywhere.
Are you reflecting Oklahoma politics?
Maybe a little. I mean, I grew up there, and I certainly also literally Tulsa is a test market town in a corporate sense. Wendy's first sneeze guards were in Tulsa. I know that sounds silly, but I mean, it's a test market town. And so if complete privatization was going to be attempted after all this shock that happened to the country, it's not going to happen in New York or LA. It's going to be attempted in a smaller city, but it's not that small. It's about the size of Austin. But imagine Austin where we don't have APD, we have Blackwater. That to me scared the shit out of me, and I wanted to write that. So that's why Tulsa. I grew up there, and then the book is also centered around this idea that in 1921, the worst race riots in American history happened. And the plot figures it, because this book takes place in 2021, you can see where I'm going there. This kind of revisits. And so, I wrote this book in 09, 010, and then all these things have been happening, as you guys know. Baltimore, Brooklyn, Ferguson, Occupy Wall Street, and I'm like, wow, wow, you can't,
So how was the book received in Oklahoma?
I read there, and people came out, and actually the Tulsa World was really cool about it and did a good piece on it, but there's a lot of reasons why anybody makes any art, but part of why I wanted to write it was to kind of show people, did you guys know this happened in 1921? Because I didn't, and when I learned about it, that drove me to write it in some way. And that it could happen again, because what sparked it was so insane. And Oklahoma politics, I mean, yeah. It's the reddest state in the Union. You think it's Mississippi? It isn't. It's Oklahoma. This book always goes to the political, and that's okay, and that discussion's fine. It's really about a little girl having a hell of a week, and how does she get out of it. But there's a big political backdrop to it. And so as time has gone on, it becomes more to that question, Oklahoma politics or red state politics or whatever. And yeah, I think certainly that comment's there. And I will tell you, and every reviewer who has looked at this has said, the questions aren't easily answered, and I'm certainly not sitting here browbeating anybody about anything. It's just, I lay it out and you kind of decide what you think. Is both sides of the spectrum politically, socio-politically, it's pretty vague. So, not a direct comment on Oklahoma politics, but more middle America politics, I would say. So, anything anybody else has? No? All right, thanks y'all, I appreciate it.